In the days when I used to write exam questions, I soon learnt that it was good practice to start with a nice, easy, general question, to get people to think about the topic, to help them to relax and to focus their attention on the issues involved. And that would then, of course, be followed up with what we used to call the real question, the hard question, the question that was designed to help us to understand where a student had really got to. And in our passage this morning, from Mark chapter 8, what we see is that Jesus seemed to be following that same pattern of questioning as he talked with his disciples. He began by asking them the easy question: who do people say that I am? And that extracted from them a fair amount of knowledge. They were able to reply. Oh, some say you're John the Baptist, others say you're Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. There was clearly a range of views held in the population at large about who Jesus was, and his disciples had picked up on that and they understood it, and that's good. It's always good when we find a church that's in contact with the people who live amongst them, around about them. And therefore the disciples were able to describe what they were hearing. And if we think about it, that's rather like the situation we might be in today. In our society, if asked that question, many people we meet might say, oh, Jesus was this, or Jesus was that. There'd be a range of thinking. However, in our passage, Jesus follows up straight away with the hard question, the real question, the question that is much more difficult to answer. He simply asks them, yeah, but what about you? Who do you think I am? Well, to answer that question, his disciples would have had to have considered all that they'd learnt from Jesus as he taught, all that they'd seen of him as they'd followed him and seen the things that he'd done. They'd have had to have compared and contrasted that with their understanding of the scripture that they would have developed as they'd been growing up. And weighing up all these things, they'd have had to have done the most important thing, and that is come to a conclusion. This question ensured that for the disciples there was no sitting on the fence. They had to answer it for themselves, and it revealed where they had got to. And what we see in the passage is that Peter, well, he seemed to have got it. He went straight to the top of the class. He answered, "You are the Christ." Peter seemed to be displaying the understanding that Jesus would have been looking for. Well, we seem to be to start with. But the problem we see is that as the story goes on, he seemed to make the mistake that we often see students make when we come to mark examination papers. We'll start to read the paper and we'll find that in the nice, easy, general question, they've given a reasonable answer. Then when it's moved on to the hard question, they started to say some really good things. And as an examiner, that's always most encouraging. We begin to think, oh yeah, this student has really got it. And then unfortunately, they go on to say something that simply reveals that they've not understood it at all. And that's exactly what we see Peter does. Because as the conversation continues, as this passage continues, what we see is Jesus began to teach how what he'd come to do necessitated him going to the cross. It necessitated him dying on the cross and the third day rising again. He started to talk about the very thing that is right at the heart of the Christian gospel. And as Jesus began to explain those things, what we see is that Peter starts to correct him. So suddenly we've got the first class student correcting the teacher. And as he does that, he receives the strongest possible rebuke. Jesus turns round to him and he says, "Get behind me, Satan." Why such a harsh rebuke? Why was Jesus so blunt with him? Simply because by saying what he did, Peter was rejecting who Jesus really is and what he'd come to do. You know, that in many ways that's still a problem today. There are many people who, when asked, would say things like, "Oh yeah, Jesus, he's a good man. Maybe he's an excellent role model. He was a great prophet, even a great prophet." But at the heart of the Christian gospel is that Jesus is much more than that. At the heart of the Christian gospel is that Jesus is himself God, come from heaven, come to earth specifically to die on a cross so that you and I can be forgiven by God. Any lesser understanding than that is simply wrong. And that matters, because what we see in our passage is that Jesus went on to tell his disciples and the crowds, it was a message for everybody, that if anyone would come after him, they must take up their cross and follow him. He makes it absolutely clear that at the heart of the gospel is the cross. It was the cross that made it possible for you and I to come to God and be forgiven. It's the cross that is at the heart of the way of life to which any follower of Jesus is called. Any lesser understanding than that really does miss the point.
Light of the world, you step down into darkness. Open my eyes, let me see beauty that made this heart adore you. Hope of a life altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me.
I do hope that you're able to join us for one of our Zoom meetings throughout the week as we discuss this passage together. Links to those meetings can be found on the website.